Hey everybody, what's going on? Dace here, and welcome back. Today is another Meet the Player episode, and I'm here with DharmaPunk. How are you doing, man?
I am doing fantastic. Fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been really looking forward to this. It's one of those things where sometimes I will reach out to people, and then it'll be like months before the session, but I always get excited when we start talking about some of the ideas that we have for topics and stuff like that. So I think this is going to be a very interesting chat. So why don't you just start us off with some of the beginnings of how you got into shmups? Like, what were some of the first experiences, maybe the first game, or like just kind of paint a bit of a picture for us if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess a little bit about me. So I was born in 81, which I'm super grateful for, because that allowed me to get on the ground floor and be part of gaming and innovation every step of the way. My first system was an Atari 7800, and then we had a neighbor who threw out his old like Commodore 64. So
Wow.
it was those two little bits, yeah, that were like the first little touches of gaming. And as a kid, I was absolutely obsessed. There was just it like clicked for me, and now almost 42 plus years later, uh, it has never unclicked. It has consistently been one of like the most fascinating and interesting hobbies in my entire life. Um, so you know, back then there wasn't really such a thing as a shmup or a shooting game or anything like that. Like genres just really weren't established.
Yep.
There were it was starting to happen, and you would have games, where I guess there was people jumping on platforms, and maybe people called them jumpers. Maybe they were calling them
Yeah,
platformers, or
who
maybe it was
knows?
just somewhere in between. Yeah, exactly. Um, so that seeing games like Space Invaders and whatnot, they were that first blueprint, but it really wasn't until like the 16-bit generation came around. And then that's where the core bits and pieces really started to kind of get laid down. And that's also where like I started to become extra interested in them. Although I think back then we just called them shooters,
Yeah.
Again, it was pretty just simple.
Yeah.
But yeah, later on, when I was probably like 15, 16 years old, I got obsessed with the system called the Neo Geo.
Hmm.
If anybody hasn't seen that, it's sort of like the old luxury car of the 16-bit generation. It was a super expensive system, and what was unique about it is that the cartridges were these just massive bricks that you would put
Yeah.
in, and like it was all just solid state RAM that would basically just not emulate the hardware experience, but it literally used the hardware of the arcade boards of the Neo Geo, like MVS systems is what it was called. So I could never afford any of those. And instead, what I got into was buying bits and pieces of old arcade cabinets.
Hmm.
And I would, talk to somebody, over in Atlanta who'd be willing to send me like a JAMA harness and, maybe an initial MVS arcade board and one game. But then I needed to figure out, well, like, how do I output it? And then so I found a monitor that I got somebody shipped me, and then eventually had to wire up some controls and like a little coin piece, blah blah blah. So very Frankenstein-like. I ended up having essentially an arcade cabinet that was just splayed out in a table in my parents' basement that I slowly just learned how to wire up and everything. But like that was the moment days. That was where all of a sudden I had the ability to play arcade boards and not just the Neo Geo stuff, but really anything that was JAMA
Hmm.
compatible, which was like pretty much everything at the time. And yeah, that opened the door. All of a sudden, I could play these games that normally were relegated to, maybe the $2 that you had in your pocket to try to figure out something that was really fast, pretty complex, sort of overwhelming.
Yep.
And now I could take my time. I could like tinker with it and explore them and start, kicking the tires and really seeing how they work.
Yeah.
And yeah, unbeknownst to me at the time, though, that like sowed deep seeds. That was everything kind of beginning to come into play.
Yeah. I think that's amazing. Just there's a lot. I could say about everything you just said, but I think some of the main things that pop out is just I love how when you have that connection with something and there's that deep intrigue, or you're curious, you want to just start absorbing it and just immerse yourself in that world, you do whatever you can to just get the parts, the pieces, like the knowledge, everything. And it's relentless. Right. And I think that is such a powerful force to be tapping into. And it's something exciting too, because you can go through life not experiencing that for most things. And I think there's always that potential there. I think it's a matter of mindset and choice, but it is neat to see those things that are so obvious where you don't even question it. You don't even have to do anything to get yourself in alignment with it. You're already on that track, and you just go. So I think that's incredible. And also just hearing about how you started, like just those first systems kind of coming into the picture, for me, like my family had a Nintendo, like just the original Nintendo, and I played things like the Mario games and whatnot and Tetris, and I enjoyed gaming, but I didn't really feel like I clicked with gaming until I think Mega Man 4. I think maybe one of my brother's friends or something brought a game over, and I saw Mega Man for the first time, and that's when it was like, oh man, like a robot, and I'm blasting other robots and like going up against these hard enemies and like these bosses and stuff. That's for me what just like pulled me in to the gaming realm, where it wasn't just a pastime. It was now like an actual interest on a deeper level. So yeah.
Do you think that was like perhaps like a little bit of like the challenge that like got your attention, or was it more like thematic and the storytelling and like the character art and everything, or sort of a mix? Or
to be honest, I think it's a mix. I've always loved things that are challenging, but I think one of the main things as a kid anyway was probably just the world, the characters. Like I always had daydreams about like the future and like robots and like flying cities and that kind of stuff. So seeing Mega Man was like, wow, like this is the best thing ever. Like how could anything ever beat this? Like this is just incredible. So that's what kind of just pulled me in. I didn't get into shmups until like way later, of course, but that's a bit of like what pulled me for just gaming in general.
That's so interesting, because I gotta admit, like, I know you're like technically interviewing me, but I have just as many questions for you.
That's one thing I always want people to just not think of it as like, oh, Dace has to be the one like asking, and it's so much about just being a natural conversation between two people and just seeing where it goes. Go crazy with the questions if you want.
So for me, right, like I grew up essentially playing these games, and although they weren't always like my total focus in terms of like genre and stuff, they were always like coming and going though, and I was pretty on top of all the different releases and stuff like that. And so most of, I guess, my earlier life up through my 20s, shmups were in total isolation. Like there was no YouTube videos about them. There were like some news groups that people would occasionally discuss them, but even then, not really. And eventually we had that one website, the was it system11.org or something? Where you suddenly had a collected group of people that were really like pulling these games apart and sharing information and stuff, and that was like a flood of information. But that wasn't something I was super following at the time, and it wasn't until just the last few years that I really got back into playing them more seriously. And in scouring YouTube for just different content creators and whatnot, I remember very specifically watching a video one day. I can't remember what I was looking up, but I just saw this like really interesting, well-spoken guy with these fascinating tattoos on his hands. And I was like, this is cool. What is this? And I started like clicking through your videos and whatnot. And I remember commenting on a couple of them, and they sort of just spurred some conversation. And then we reached out over, I don't know, Instagram or Facebook or something like that. And there was a few back and forths. But that ultimately now leads us to sitting here, which is so cool, especially to think of it as shmup sports that are such a solitary pursuit, still often very much are just by design. But then growing up and them being not something that you ever got together and did like you would maybe with like fighting games that have natural community.
Absolutely.
Um, and even despite all that, here we are now
Yeah.
in the future
Yeah.
with the robots, able to talk over, a video connection.
Yeah.
It's pretty awesome.
And I think part of and yeah, absolutely. And like, I think what's really cool is, not that this was necessarily like my plan from the start. Like, I think when I started this series, it was just like, I want to just talk to people. I want to get to know the players because there's so much focus on just gameplay. But I'm more interested in like what people go through, how they got started. So, but what ended up happening was there was just so much more that came through in each episode, and it just starts to paint a picture for people of all these different individuals that make up the community. And so when people just get to know each other more and more, there's just that much more connection, that much more strength. And
Yeah.
I think that's just really cool. So it's amazing that
Yeah.
from you stumbling upon a video of mine, here we are now, like you said. It's just awesome.
Yeah. And I've also just quickly noticed, because I've taken deep dives into other genres. Like I primarily come from like fighting games. That's like my big thing. I like competing in them. I'm one of those dudes that flies out to Evo and like loves just to get together with a community of people, and like you're constantly, grinding against each other, iron sharpening iron and whatnot.
Yeah.
But yeah, when it comes to shmups and stuff, it's suddenly, well, I would say the fighting game genre, like that has a lot of personalities in it. Like it's some hilarious personalities, some scathing ones. It's like all across the spectrum, I guess. And then other genres feel, I don't know, a little bit more just chill and normal, and I don't see quite as much. Shmups, though, man, I feel like of all the people that I've met with and engaged in, Shmups has the most sort of eccentric diversity in the amount of people that are the types of people that play them.
Yeah.
I've talked to people that are like investment bankers, and are absolute mathematical crushing whizzes. And then shmups are, this crazy pastime that they love to apply some of that like critical thinking to. I've met people that were like vagabonds, and would just have this, an old handheld that they would just grind away on, and that it was sort of this, meditative pastime for them. I've met other people that were like archivists. One of my best friends is super into like curating a really nice archival collection of games. And he has a collection of really, really awesome shmups amongst other things. And the way he, engages with them is much more of like a curiosity and documentation, and almost like leaning into like the ritual of it. And again, I could name off another 7 people that would show up as just as eccentric characters as you could put in, any interesting cast.
That's really fascinating. And in ways, it doesn't surprise me, because when I think about how the way I see shmups, there is something very simplistic and pure about it. And so I think from that, even though it might look like this limited experience, it's actually so full of potential for people to connect with it for different reasons. And I think that's part of why you would have like a bank person, or like this other kind of person or whatever, because there's so many facets to the shmup experience that you can just really dive deeply into and start digging and just make it your own experience, your own relationship with that. And so that doesn't surprise me, but it's also one of the coolest things about shmups, because I don't think I really feel that way about other genres. I think others have their own form of just like the way they've matured and the way they've kind of come into their present day incarnation or whatever. I think there's just a more specific way that most people connect with it, and there isn't as much room for making it your own thing. Like when I think about racing games,
Mm.
for instance, there are certainly similarities between shmups and racing games, but I don't think I see the same kinds of minds popping up in racing games as I do with shmups. And it's the same
Yeah.
with fighting games. Like there are tons of personalities, but there's just something very unique about shmups in my opinion.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I think a couple of things you hit on there is part of that. Like shmups themselves are like an ancient ancestor in terms of like the genres that make up,
Hmm.
video games. And they're probably of all the genres, one of I don't want to say least evolved because there's been many changes,
Yeah,
but like the principal quality of it is you can trace it like right
absolutely.
back, like it feels like working with like a living fossil in a
Hmm.
way.
Yep.
Like everything that you're playing, in a modern game that just came out today probably has roots that can be traced like not just inspired by, but like directly back.
Hmm.
Um, which is quite interesting. And like you get this thing that it brings history with it by just engaging in the genre. But it's also usually a completely solitary thing that you do.
Yeah.
For most people that I talk to, co-op is sort of just one of those things that are just like, oh, novelty. But they primarily play them by themselves.
Yeah.
Um, Yet they can still be so social, which is interesting. And I think it's if they get you, if it's something that's resonating with you, you're probably having this kind of personal experience, and it probably means that you have a bit of introspection going, or some sort of like
Yeah.
intellectual feedback loop,
Hmm.
that's creating these sparks. And I think what comes from that is just naturally a lot of personality. Yeah.
Totally.
So I'm curious about again, as somebody who got into shmups later,
Hmm.
um, what were the ones that like really like hooked you? Because I'm sure you played, some of those early NES ones or some 16-bit ones and whatnot. But at some point, like the hook must sunk into the flesh,
Yeah.
something got you to stick around and dig deeper.
Yeah. So I'll just lightly touch, like I've told this story so many times, but not the part I'm about to get into, which will answer your question. But the part that people know already, or most people probably do, is that in 1995, I got Solar Striker for Game Boy. That was my first shmup.
Mm.
Like you mentioned earlier, like I didn't view it as a genre. At that point, it was just another game. Like as a kid, you kind of just, all right, this is a game where you're controlling a spaceship, and then in a Mario game, it's like, okay, you're the guy who like jumps around, and in other ones, it's like, okay, you're
Mhm.
moving blocks and like getting rid of lines so that you don't overload the screen. So that was the only shmup I ever played until 2018. So from 1995 until 2018, when I got Stared in Binary Stars on Switch. And what's interesting is
Mm.
prior to the game coming out, we were on the verge of going to Nepal to live for a while. And I remember seeing the trailer for Sterden because it was upcoming. And I was like, man, that looks so cool. But I wasn't intrigued by it because it was a bullet hell game. What caught my attention was the fact that it was a roguelike. For I like leading up to that time, I was getting more and more into roguelikes. There was something about the randomization,
Oh.
the insane difficulty, needing to just do run after run. And so I had that kind of foundation. And then when I saw Sterden was coming out, it was like, wow, the things am now loving, except now it's in like a spaceship kind of experience where you control a ship and there are like these big bosses. Like, wow, that's so cool. And
Mhm.
I didn't at that point. I still didn't think about there being a genre. That was still completely out of my mind. It was just like, oh, cool, like a spaceship roguelike. That's awesome. So I got into that, and I just went all in on that game. And it was like very, very difficult. Some of the bosses were just crazy, but when I came out of it, and then I saw Danmaku Unlimited 3, and I jumped into that next, I was just like, this is true bullet hell now, and this is like where you really see what the games demand from you. And that's when my eyes were opened, and I was just like, gobble up every shmup I could find. It didn't matter. Like I wasn't
Yeah.
always paying full price or anything, but I would like wait for sales. But my eyes were open for all the titles now, and I was just
Yeah.
lapping everything up, playing as much as I could. And that was kind of what, those two games were kind of like the stepping stones that pulled me in. But because
Wow.
of a totally different genre.
Can we rewind for
Yeah,
just a
yeah.
moment? So am I painting the picture right that like you were planning a trip to Nepal and so you're leaning into your handhelds, as like a little bit of like recreation?
Well, actually, I
So,
didn't take my Switch with me. I think
oh, okay.
like I stumbled upon Sterden, and then we went on the trip, and then when I came back, I was like, I still want that game. So that's
Oh,
kind of how it
cool.
was. Yeah, there was just
Yeah,
this
yeah.
burning passion for jumping in.
How interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. Nepal is I've got a buddy out there that runs like an elephant like rescue
Oh,
sanctuary.
super cool.
And yeah, I met him while traveling in India, and I've always had this open invitation to go to
Nice.
Nepal. So yeah, whenever I hear it, it echoes in the back of my head,
Yeah.
this thing that's like, yes, come visit
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, we
One day.
yeah, it's pretty awesome. We lived in the mountains with a family for a while, and then we moved to Kathmandu and stayed there for a little
Oh,
bit before eventually coming
oh,
back to
cool.
Canada. So,
Nice.
yeah,
Was this before you had the kiddos?
yeah, definitely. It was
Yeah.
2018, and then we had the kids, and I think, or the first one in 2021 or so. Yeah, give or take.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. I have a feeling we could probably talk for hours about travel alone,
Yeah, yeah,
so I,
definitely.
I won't derail us too much. But yeah, putting a note in that though. Yeah, super curious about that.
Hmm.
How cool. So it was coming back and almost sort of kind of blending the genres is what got
Yep.
your foot in, and then you like pulled the switch and then
Yeah.
not and then went all in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then from there, it just, I very quickly realized that, okay, this is a full blown passion that is just bombarding me right now. I had
Mm.
a YouTube variety channel at the time for like Switch games, and I noticed that, okay, every upload is just a shmup now. It's not anything else. So I said, okay, before everything crashes and burns in this like beautiful explosion of just shmups and everything else is like cast aside, I need to set aside a
Yeah.
different channel. And so that's when I started Shmuptopia as a necessity, like just to save everything else that was going on so that the world didn't end. So
I
that's
love that, like, your rampant burning love needed
yeah.
to be like
Funneled, yeah.
segregated, lest it burn down the whole castle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Oh man.
Wow,
And
man.
the
And I
rest
love that you
yeah.
mentioned too that like that it just kind of takes you over, when you get
Hmm.
really into something. Like I mentioned, being, 15 years old and exposed to the early arcade boards and stuff.
Yeah.
I had no right to be like trying to solder this stuff together in my basement. Like I had no idea what I was doing. There was like hardly any manuals for this. Like I was, probably lucky I didn't shock myself to death.
Crazy.
But that's like, the brilliant hubris of being a kid with a lot of passion
Hmm.
is like you don't really worry about the how so much.
Yeah.
It's all about the why, and you just lean into
Totally.
that. It's really refreshing too, though, to that it's not just relegated or lost, on the being a kid.
Yeah.
That's something that, is very much still part of adult life as well.
Hmm.
Now, when you were feeling that, where you're like, suddenly into shmups and you have that crazy curiosity and you're going down the rabbit holes, does that feel like a pretty natural process? Or do you feel like you're steering it at all? Do you feel like you're like stoking the flames? Or are you just like along for the ride?
That's a great question. That's an amazing question. I think because of how other passions have functioned, like in my adult life and stuff. Like I've been playing ocarina since 2012 or 2013, and just percussion like since I was 18, and all this other stuff.
Oh,
So I
cool.
think those have always been very similar, where I go in and I do nothing but those things day in, day out.
Mm,
So for this, it was like, okay, like this, I recognize it for what it is, or at least as much as I can like in any given moment, and I plunge in and I just go with it. But I think what starts to change is when you start using something like YouTube, where it's not just something you're doing by yourself because you love it. You're attempting to serve some kind of purpose with that. So that's a very different experience. And so in that sense, I'm not sure if I would say that I'm steering the passion itself or something, but I think I'm steering something because of the passion. Like I certainly have an aim that I want to just like shoot for, and different people that I want to serve with what I'm doing and stuff like that with YouTube. But the underlying theme, of course, is the fact that I love shmups, and I think my nature is helping and equipping people and all this kind of stuff. So it's like, how can I have those things fusing and just being the best thing that it can be for other people while still just being in this experience myself?
That's very cool. That like bridges some of the gaps, you know, where it's not just self-serving. It's just not like hedonistic entirely, which is normally how people tend to look at games, which is totally fine. You know, they're there for fun, they're there for enjoyment, engagement, or whatnot. But yeah, I think that's one of the cool things that comes from YouTube is it suddenly gives you a means to like share some of that, but with it comes, you know, a little bit of weight and maybe even personal responsibility of like, I want to make sure I make something good, or I want to share these ideas or communicate it this way. Like I recently listened to your interview conversation with Spider STG. And now I've never talked to that guy in person. I just have left some comments here and there. But he's another one that just in the last, I don't know, year or so, I just started seeing some of his videos pop up. And like, I love his videos. They're very unique, and he has a lot of like his personality in them. And he's got really good music taste. He's got a cool sense of humor, good timing to it. And like they tell a story. I think that's sort of what makes him kind of unique. You know, they have a certain like long form campfire quality to it in a way, you know? And one of the things I think he was talking about was like, once you start making these videos, you know, you're a little vulnerable and exposed, but you know, you come with it with that genuine heart first. And you get to, you know, kind of trust that you'll connect with those people. You know, and he added a lot more details. I'm not even going to try to like paraphrase it or anything. But it's interesting that you guys both share some of that as well. Now, me, I've only made like 1 or 2 YouTube videos. If anything, it serves as just sort of like a personal artifact notebook of like some of the prototypes I've been working on, or just odd little clips and whatnot. So I'm so curious of what it's like on the other side. Now, like of all the YouTubers out there, everybody, again, like Shmups is pretty interesting in that you have like the heavy gameplay design analysis of like Bog Hog and Mark MSX, and then you have the almost nostalgic like joy of it that like Shmup Junkie kind of brings, you know, and it's this other like colorful, bombastic quality that he does really well. But you in particular, Dace, like you have the gather around sort of quality. Like you have the quality of like leading people up the mountain to show them a beautiful sunset and contemplatively sip coffee and enjoy the slow burn. And like, and again, that's so different from what anybody else is doing. That's why I really enjoy your content in particular. But you're also quite prolific, which I find impressive. Like a dad of 2, you know, super involved in your family, you've got work, you've got career, you've got life, you've got probably, you know, 40 other things that I have no idea about, yet you still find time to consistently put out those videos. Like, at that, I'll let you just respond to that, because I feel like I just unrolled a rug of thoughts, but yeah.
It's wild because, for instance, I think it was last month, and it, like, not every video I put out is like this full blown like project. Some are just like, okay, I'm checking out a game for 5 minutes and just sharing how it works and stuff like that. But I remember thinking last month, at one point, it's like, man, I don't feel like I've done enough this month. And then I looked and it's like, holy smokes, I've actually put out 6 videos. Like, why? Like, there doesn't need to be 6 videos per month. There could be 1 a week or even less. There could be 1 or 2 a month. But I think for me, there's just part of me that wants to share things. There's a part of me that wants to always strive to improve the quality and the value. I don't just want to like dish stuff out for the sake of quantity. I want like actual, I want there to be actual substance in my videos. But sometimes it's just like, well, okay, here's a short thing. I'm just going to let it be what it is, and I'm just going to offer it up for people to see. So I think some months are like jam packed in that sense. Other times I feel like, okay, I really haven't done much lately, but there's just so much going on in life. There are behind the scenes Shmuptopia projects that are in the works and all this kind of stuff. So it's a wild balance of just, I always want to be working on videos. I always want to be doing things for Shmuptopia just to further it along, to offer things to people. So regardless of whether it's crazy or not, which it always is, there's just always that drive to like every free moment I have, I want to be doing shmup stuff. I want to be doing Shmuptopia stuff. And just, I think because of that drive, that's why you probably see this prolific, like unraveling, like happening like month after month.
Yeah.
But it's nuts. It's honestly nuts. Because like in our situation, like Autumn is she works from home and she does computer work. So I pretty much watch the kids all day so that they're not pestering her nonstop, so she can do her work. And so pretty much all, like, there is literally no free time. So I'm sometimes amazed that I even get anything done, because it's like, well, okay, it's 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Sometimes they don't go to sleep until 11 o'clock. And it's like, okay, well, now I have to do everything right now before sleep. So these days I'm up until like 3 or 4 or 5 in the morning, just because I will not go to sleep until I have done this, and this. Like, it's just it's just my commitment. So that's what I'm doing. And that's, that's that. So
that seems,
go ahead.
I was going to say that seems like the right kind of discipline and attitude that like matches this genre as well. And there's certainly many ways you can engage with it. You know, you can play them super casually. You can be a total kind of tourist about it. Like, and there's no wrong way, to be super clear. Like, you can do whatever you want with them. It is 100% awesome. Just, you know, hopefully keep your eyes on them. That's my only ask personally, out of just pure love of the genre. But for me, the setting goals within shmups and working towards them and applying a little bit of discipline is where all the fruit is. Like that's the kind of stuff where I start to learn about how my mind works. It becomes a sandbox where I'm able to address little elements in my own mind as I'm going through that, whether it be, you know, just trying to keep my heart rate chill, managing anxiety, whether that be like working on my peripheral vision and, you know, being able to like map things and like lining up the dexterity, whether it be routing and so forth. As we get deeper and deeper into all of that, it is not necessarily easy. In fact, it's often really, really quite hard. And that's something that I think we're all a little bit shy to talk about, because especially when it comes to new players, you don't want to scare them away. You know, you don't want to like turn into a drill sergeant and tell them they need to have the iron discipline in order to 1cc or they're never going to have any value at all. You know, which is silly, but it's also inescapable that these games, you know, to get into those deeper folds, they do require work.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot we could talk about right now in just on the topic of like new people coming in and what they see because of how everyone who's already here is shaping the picture for everyone who will come in. So there's a boatload of stuff. This could be like a 6-hour chat for sure. But
tell me a little bit about what comes to mind when you think about how people are shaping it. And I also have a follow-up question, which is like, do you feel any responsibility yourself as sort of an ambassador that, you know, new players might find your channel?
Okay, so the way I kind of view, like, it's tricky to say like there's one view that people are going to see, because there are all these different sources like YouTube channels or whatever where people are pushing a certain idea, and then over here they're pushing a different idea, or they're just focusing on different things if they're not even like necessarily pushing like a certain way to approach these games. So I think when people come in, and again, this, like, I can only say so much because I'm not coming into it for the first time. I don't have that eye, like that set of eyes. But I feel like there is that initial sense of just being tugged in a million different directions, because some people will be recommending games, saying like, oh, play this, play this, play this. There will be, let's say, a list of, oh, like these are the easiest ones for beginners, blah, blah, blah. Like all these different things for people to do, or just kind of like, great, you just got off the plane and you're just being pushed here and there. You're not really, I think what would be the best for people jumping in is to just play what looks like the coolest thing they've ever seen. And just allowing themselves to let their own intuition kind of lead them, at least for a while. It's like, I'm not saying never like take a suggestion from someone else or like get advice or help, or like if you want to like go in a certain direction or whatever. But I think that when we come into something and we just immediately give up our voice and our power to choose, then we've already kind of compromised our experience to some level, because now we're just doing what someone else is saying or pointing to or whatever the case is, and you're not really sinking into the experience that you could be based on what you would naturally stumble upon if you were kind of just leading yourself. So I think that's kind of like just a broad way of answering your question. The second part, I never want people to think that I'm some kind of like authority just because I have a YouTube channel. I think, so I'm not sure like if I would say that I feel like I'm an ambassador. Like, I think the way I view it is I just want to share what I feel is like a healthier way to connect, a way that nurtures more growth. And it's all because I want people to be tapping into their greatest potential and being able to express themselves in the shmup experience in a way that is in the greatest alignment with who they are and where they need to get to. So that's probably just how I will word that.
You hit on a lot of interesting stuff there. Kind of working my way backwards with the most recent. I like that you highlight that it might not be the best approach to be onboarded through, you must play these 5 first. If you didn't play Dodonpachi, you're not going to understand, blah, 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 blah. Because what ends up happening is like, you might have a great time with those, but they also probably feel very prescribed, and like medicine's usually a little bitter. It's a lot better if you find, healthy foods to heal you first. I don't know. That was sort of a weird holistic metaphor that half happened and half didn't. But and instead to approach it so that like, you just find the stuff that like is just interesting. Maybe, because we get this idea that like we have limited time and we should be playing the best stuff, and you should get the creme de cremes first, and, only then should you be tasting this lukewarm stuff over here. But it's so silly, because there's so many games that I got into specifically because they were crazy and bombastic, that I just loved the energy that they had. And like, maybe I don't go back to them. Maybe they didn't have the kind of depth, and I ultimately outgrew that. But that's totally fine. 100%, and there's a lot of other games that were not bombastic, and in fact were really kind of ugly, but they might have had one mechanic that I just found so interesting, or found myself having an internal kind of conversation about. Maybe it really pissed me off, and I just kept going back to it in a weird way, like scratching an itch. And that created, a different kind of relationship with this game or that game and so forth. But most importantly, like, that's my journey. I get to kind of author my way through this genre. And then wherever I end up, I think I can feel a lot better about how I got there. Because it was my investment that got there. And it would be such a shame to shortchange people from that, No,
you said it perfectly. Just the fact that you are the one taking the steps, you are the one making those choices, and it's coming from you, not some external source saying this, and this. And so again, like, I'm not going to say to people to not do things the way they want. Some people come into it and they have no idea, and they may not be coming from a place in life where they have that kind of foundation of like just listening to themselves. Maybe they've always just sort of done what others, or they just see something and they go for that. But
Yeah.
but I do feel it's important to just do more listening to like the inside and go from there.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's sort of inescapable, but one thing that happens to pop up in like this community is that you get a lot of people that are getting into arguments over whether something is good or bad. And it's this sort of like tug of war over value,
Mm-hmm.
um, like ascribed value. And what is often happening is, again, it's sort of the nature of the genre, in that these are very personal experiences. And I also, I'm fully acknowledging that I love how silly this is, that there's a paradox underneath it, that these are so simple in a lot of ways. We're talking about moving pixels down a vertical alley and flinging like rectangles up a screen.
Mm-hmm.
And like, and then on the other side of it, trying to deconstruct, the nature of people, and like their personal experiences and their value judgments. But like, that's kind of what's beautiful for it. Like, I love that paradox is sort of at the heart of it, that there's elegance there. Anyway, yeah, you get a lot of people that they, started playing a game like Signy, for example.
Yeah.
And they're like, this is so much fun. Like, it's crazy. It's so unique. I don't have to worry about dodging as much. Like, it feels more like I can just, you know, tunnel through the game, blowing stuff up, and it's just wicked cool. And then somebody else will chime in and they'll be like, well, that's fine. But the real issue is that like the enemy, placement and the level design is really uninspired, and like it makes it essentially just a one-time playthrough, and there's nothing to return to because there's nothing to interact with in terms of design. Now, like, they might not be wrong. I mean, their opinions either way. But the guy who's talking about design, he's talking about very technical things that we can look at and we can deconstruct. Whereas the other person is talking about their personal experience and the emotions that they felt, and that's what's driving them.
Yeah.
But they compare them in the same kind of way, which is whether this game is good or not. And like, that's a bit of like a broken fallacy the second we start doing that. But we don't acknowledge that, because most people don't realize that that's happening until they're, 6 posts deep in a internet thread, and they're up at 2 a.m. trying to think of their retort.
Yeah, it's interesting how when we feel strongly about something, 1 second, I gotta clear my throat. When we feel strongly about something, we kind of like, it's so easy to just make it about saying what we want to say and getting heard, getting our voice, that bit out. But sometimes it will have nothing to do with where the other person is coming from. If someone was just like it's like, if let's say a kid, like a 3-year-old kid, played a shooter, they're going to be stoked about everything that's going on. They're not going to care what the design is. They're not going to care what the labels of the game are, like any of this stuff. They're coming from a very different place. And you can, all day long, you can just say like, oh, well, I don't like it because this, and this, or like, here's the issue, here's the other issue, blah, blah, blah. It's like, you can put so much time and energy into this kind of stuff, but you do need to remember that different people are going to care about different things. They're going to be looking at it through a different lens. And so the things you are so passionate about forcing into like the picture so that everyone else can read your posts and hear, like that is not always going to be meaningful. That is not going to mean everything to someone else. Sometimes I will just be like, well, okay, this person doesn't like it, and that's all it can mean to them, because they're not equipped in the same way the other person is equipped with how they're looking at this game. So yeah.
So maybe to take on a slightly lighter subject.
Sure.
I'm always curious about, of course, like what people's favorite shmups are. And I think I've actually seen some videos of you talking about some of that. Let me posit something a little bit different though. What would make a really good desert island shmup? What's one that would keep you coming back and have like that longevity? Like, what do you need in a game to keep you coming back?
That's a really great question. It's such a mix of things because I love all different types, and when I think about my favorites, that's just as varied. Like in each one, there might be three or four things that just nail the game, and so that's
Mm.
what pulls me in. But I think when it comes to like the whole desert island thing, that's really tricky. I think given what I know about myself, it could just be like rolling gunner on expert mode. Like
Mm.
I could just play that forever. Um, and it's not because like if someone else was in my shoes, I don't think it would be the ideal thing. Like I think it's just because
Yeah.
of my relationship with that game that I can literally be in that game forever. If I never touch another shmup, that is fine by me. So I would easily go with that. In terms
I
of
don't know if
let's
the
say
Rolling Gunner devs are watching right now, but they should put that on the box.
I think if I let's say I had to like choose a retro game, like something that came out way back, uh,
Mm.
Gunnail would probably be the next
Oh yeah.
one. I love that one. I remember when that one
Hmm.
came out, and there were a lot of complaints about like the hitbox size and like all these other things, and it was one of those situations where you see so much of what people are saying, and it's so skewed by their struggles and not necessarily about what the game is actually offering or providing in terms of what I feel is the way to play it. Like, I think there was a very specific design in that game, and I think a lot of people, in ways, they jump in thinking it's going to be a certain way or should be acting like other games. And so we
Mm.
have this struggle where something feels very difficult at first, and then we have these reasons that come
Hmm.
up, and it's just like, oh, okay, now it's time to like start hating on this game. And so when I started seeing all that kind of stuff, it inspired me to do a video, which I called like "Got Nail, a Misunderstood Classic" or whatever, and it
Great
was more or
title.
less just kind of like going through these things that people are talking about. But I think the reason
Hmm.
I bring up Gun Nail is because there is just there's awesome music, amazing graphics for the time. The action is just such a blast. The boss fights are wicked. Like there's just so much room for doing what I do in these games. Like I love breaking things
Hmm.
down to a complete science, like through stage
Mm.
practice or save states or whatever. I love just dissecting and just really coming to connect with the experience that's
Hmm.
in there. And so I think that's another one where with the scoring that you can do, whether you're playing for scoring or just going for a no miss or like whatever, there's just a ton you could do. So I could play that on a desert island easily.
That's a great answer. I've we all go through like I would say like a shmup tourist kind of stage,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a very natural thing. Like I will, you know, play 5, 6 games over the course of a week. And then one of them will kind of catch me, and then maybe I sink more time into that. And then every once in a while, like the harpoon really like takes heart,
Yeah,
and you're like, "This
yeah,
is a white whale. I'm
yeah.
getting this
And you're
one."
going down
You
with
know?
it. Into
Yes. Yeah, yeah. And like, I don't think you always get to necessarily choose what that one is going to be. In fact, that's part of the fun of
mm-hmm.
being sort of a tourist is,
Yeah,
waiting until that one hooks you. One of them that hooked me and like probably becomes a desert island game for me is Ray Force. So
yeah.
yeah, also known as like Galactic Attack, and I think it has another third name
Mm-hmm.
as well, but that's how I always know it. Um, and this is one, if nobody's ever played it, it was like 1995 or so, and it was that peak 16-bit and then also like early 32-bit. It's
Yeah.
in this sweet spot in between the two where it's still pixel art, but they're now using interesting zooming and
Mm-hmm.
different kinds of uh, parallax effects and whatnot that they wouldn't normally be able to do because the scaling wasn't available in the hardware. Um, that game, though, for me, you could take all the different pieces and parts out of it and just distill it down to, a square that shoots and moves. And the game is designed so well that it would still be just as fun to play.
Yeah.
Um, that was one that my best friend, this guy named Mike in Cincinnati, he had been bugging me to play this game for a while. And I was like, I'll get to it, I'll get to it, I'll get to it. And then the second I played it, like you said, boom, I just like,
down,
I'm going down with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And before I knew it, I played through it. And how we always approached games, and we still do, is we'll often give each other like the $2 challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So we're like, hey, if you had $2, that's like 8 credits. Like, see if you can beat this game. That's like just enough to lean into it to maybe, miss your goal and have to tighten up, which forces you to engage with the mechanics a little bit differently. Get you to critically think about different situations and maybe a little bit more strategy, maybe how to get an extend, and so on. So I got that. And then I was like, okay, 4cc challenge. And I was like, oh, okay, this game is getting really good. Like at that point, when you get to like the 4cc like range, you're now starting to think about like, hey, how do I actually dismantle these bosses piece by piece, draw out the boss fight, get more points, to get that extra life or two, and then carry it forward. And at that point too, the early parts of the levels where it's in some games just totally autopilot, Rayforce is designed in a way that there's new things to discover even after you've done this stage 50, 60, 100 times. And like or ways to be a little bit riskier but to get more reward, which is super awesome. I think that's like a really fundamental piece of design that can add just instant depth to any shmup. But yeah, eventually Rayforce became that one where I was like, oh, I got to do this. Like, I think I have it in me to like get the 1cc. So like, let's do it, let's lock in. And so much like you, all of a sudden, I've got save states and I'm, redoing a sequence 3 or 4 times. And I start really experimenting with it. Like I've got a lab code on at this point, and I'm like, okay, what happens if I pull them out? What if I start my ship in the far right? They're going to aim and it gives me enough berth to be able to sweep low and then be in the right position to take on the next wave. And I was like, oh, so good, you start really like drinking that kind of Kool-Aid. And it got to the point where I was doing the save state runs. I was lining up really nice runs, and I was like I could feel it in my bones. I was like, I'm going to get it. I'm going to get it. Like, I just need to diligently keep coming back to it. Yep. And, at that point, I was like, all right, no more save states. Now these are runs. I'm going for it, Cue the Olympic music. I feel it. And my buddy Mike at the time, he actually bought the arcade board. Oh, and wow. He had this, and he has this arcade cabinet. It's an old, I think it was a X-Men Children of the Atom cabinet that he restored. It was awesome. And he changes the monitor, sets it up to like Tate orientation, so it's like proper vertical. And he's like, hey, when you come back to visit Cincinnati over the holidays, like you can play as much Rayforce as you want on original hardware. And I was like, yes. And that extra element, because like I definitely have a slight flair for the drama. That like if there's an opportunity, to go on stage and like really shoot your shot and go for it, I'm like, that's the way. Like, nice. I kind of believe in like authoring, that those scenes for yourself and pushing yourself. And for me, I was like, of course, thank you, universe. You were conspiring for me. You provided me with an arcade cabinet through my friend. This is where I will get that 1cc. And so I go over. And like an interesting thing happened. At that point, in my brain, in my little heart of hearts, I wanted to get the 1cc on the original arcade cabinet because it felt so poetic. Mm-hmm. And like something changed a little. Like that, when you're really going for a goal like that, you almost have to put on that fighter's mindset. It's like going into the ring and you're like, no distraction. I'm going to do this, let's set aside this time, you work on it, you train on it, training montage, all that good stuff, but you focus and like it sets a fire in you. And when I decided that I was going to get the 1cc in Cincinnati, that little fire changed. All of a sudden my runs, they didn't matter as much. And like, I just stopped taking it as seriously. And so I get to Cincinnati. I start practicing a little bit on my laptop. I still am playing it every day just to keep up with it because it's just satisfying and I love the routine and the discipline of it.
Yeah.
And I go over to his house, and like I'm all set up for it. And I can't do it. I fail. And like 2 hours has passed. I fail a couple more times and I'm like, okay, tonight's not the night, but this is how the story works, right? Like you gotta have a little bit of extra drama, of course. So I have one more shot, a little later in the visit. I go back to his place, I line everything up. And although I have a really good run and I set a personal best score and like hit like 3.5 million or something like that. And I was like, I feel good about that, but it feels like a consolation prize. Like I didn't get the thing, so a little crestfallen. I go back to Texas and funny enough, like that was what was necessary. I kind of had to get my butt kicked on stage and fail. Like that was the teacher that like switched everything around. Because once I came back to Texas, like I had a chip on my shoulder.
Yeah.
And like that's when I actually started documenting the process. And I would just record like myself actually playing it, I'd record my footage, and I kind of went at it with a vendetta. I was like, I am going to get this. And I'm kind of mad that it took away my magical moment, Rayforce, and I did, and I made a little video about it and stuff. But now having gone through that whole process and I eventually did get the 1cc and this was also like the Steam version. And I just so happened because I spent so much time doing routing and like you said, again, being curious and exploring the scoring system and like really tweaking things and really ironing it out and like authoring my way through that game. I had a route that felt like mine and nobody else did it like I did it. Everybody else had other ways and their ways were often better, but I had mine. And by the time I got that, I got the 1cc and my score was so solid from doing all that previous work that like I managed to get like fourth on like the Steam global leaderboards.
Amazing.
Which was like pretty cool. Now, Dace, have I ever gone back and looked at that score again? No.
Yeah.
And I never will because I'm sure I'm notched all the way and I'm probably off the top 10 at this point, which is totally fine. But I get to keep it pristine in my memory. So but yeah, that is definitely one of my desert island games. And it's because I know it so inside and out that playing it feels like it's just wired to my brain.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of experience playing that game than any others, even though they might look very similar.
Yeah. That's one thing that like anytime anyone hears me saying like how much I love going deep or I'm encouraging people to experiment with that kind of experience, like not that you can force that on a game, you have to really connect with a game and then you can just take it to those depths. But that's what I'm talking about. It's like when you just day in, day out, you are building that into your daily life. And it's not just about like, oh, okay, yeah, cool, I'm playing a game here and there when I can. It's like you've brought things into such a like there's just such a structure and it's literally a part of your like living and breathing every moment. Like that is when things are just incredible. Like if you stumble upon a game like that, that's what I mean when I say like I can play Rolling Gunner and like literally not any other shmup, but any other video game. I if I was on that desert island, Rolling Gunner on expert difficulty is that kind of connection for me, where it's like I know it like the back of my hand because it is me at this point. And like and that's not to say there isn't tons more to learn and tons more to do and all this kind of stuff, but that's just like a way of saying like that's the kind of connection you can have with these games if you are open to it and you are willing to kind of just surrender to everything that will be involved with taking it to that depth. So it's amazing to hear about. And interestingly enough, you mentioning Rayforce, I did watch your video again because I watched it when it came out and I loved it, but I watched it a couple days ago and was like, man, this is so good. Like, I would love if you did more YouTube videos because you're one of the one of the other people who I feel is a little more and I'm not saying others aren't like this, but I think when people aren't vocal or they don't have a channel themselves, it's tricky to know what people are like or what they might do or what they might talk about in videos. But you're one of those other individuals that it feels more geared toward the journey, like just how important that is, how much there is to just savor and just sink into and connect with. And so anytime you want to do more shmup videos like that, by all means, I will lap up everyone.
Nice. I appreciate that, man. Yeah, yeah. My girlfriend would as well. She's always encouraging me to make more content and just document it, you know? Yeah, I gotta get into it. And maybe yeah, sidebar conversation. I'd love to talk to you more about your process of actually making the videos.
Sure.
Because, I'd never really made a YouTube video before. And I had fun doing it, but like I had to essentially learn every step of the way of the editing and how to approach it and stuff. And I'm sure it took me way too long to make the video because of all the stumbling blocks. So yeah, later on I'll have to ask you about what your process is, what software and stuff.
I would love to chat about that. So where do we want to go from here?
Yeah, right. We're kind of bouncing all over. We could talk
like I still have questions I could jump into, or we can even just get into some of the other, like the main talking points that we did kind of discuss a little bit on Facebook before this. What are you feeling?
Yeah, let's maybe let's talk a little bit about like design and maybe what we'd like to see with shmups and maybe some interesting places to take them. That's something I'm really curious about. What kind of stuff bubbles up in your mind, and I certainly have some ideas and some thoughts, and I think it also highlights sort of design elements that maybe go a little underknown or underappreciated, which might be just good listening in overall.
Yeah, certainly, I would love if you just led the way with that.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll chime in after with my 2 cents, but I would love to hear what your thoughts on that, to be honest.
Okay.
I'm excited for that.
Yeah, so okay, talking about mechanics and maybe like favorite mechanics in particular is something I think about a lot. Now, like having just talked about Rayforce, I'll tell you some of my favorite mechanics. I love a good lock-on. It goes hand in hand with like that swarm missile kind of approach. And I don't know if you grew up watching much of like the big robot anime when it really had its heyday, but like you had like Robotech and Macross and a handful of others. But for me as a kid, the coolest thing to see was swarm missiles, where you would see 16 of them fly out, taking these weird irregular paths. They look like bats, with like tracers flying through the sky before exploding in like separate little pops and whatnot. And what's cool about that is you get to convey this kind of kinetic sense, and it adds a little bit of wild variety as well, especially if how you handle the missiles themselves, if they have like a random kind of quality to it. But it goes hand in hand with risk reward. And in terms of game design, I think that's such a good well to go to. There's so much neat stuff that can come out of that. For instance, with a good lock-on system, it usually is sacrificing your ability to shoot, maybe so that you can lock on, and there's sort of this press pull of, like you're going to press in, but not too far, and then pull back and let it all go, which is very cool. Again, very kind of kinetic, which I think is a great thing, especially with shmups, to lean on. The other way you can do it with something like Rayforce is that you can shoot the entire time, but you can only lock on sort of like Zuvius, in that it had like a targeting reticle, that's
line up with an actual. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're doing a little bit of multitasking. You're now kind of painting over a few enemies. And maybe that means that you need to get to different parts of the screen in order to get the lock on. And maybe that means that you need to ignore, these enemies that you would normally just gun down. And so all of a sudden, this creates these new problems to solve. Like I want to get the lock on because the lock on gets me the best score and maybe takes out the ground enemies, which fire aimed shots, which can be super suppressive. But it now means that I have to deal with a swarm of enemies that I neglected intentionally.
totally.
And now I have to do this big macro swoop in order to take care of them. And the second that's happening, we're now introducing almost like gracefulness into the games.
Totally.
You know, there's this dance that's happening.
100%.
And like it's that dance that I think is one of the things that's underseen and underappreciated in shmups. And it goes hand in hand with one, the level design, the enemy design, how it pushes the player around, and then how they maybe push the enemies around by trying to quick kill them and what kind of positions they put themselves into. But the best parts of it, and I'm sure you've experienced this in games before, is when you can tell that the developer knows what you want to do or where you're ultimately going to end up.
For sure.
It can foresee the conclusions that you're going to arrive at, and then give you sort of a curveball. You know, all of a sudden you run into something and, it just clips you and you die, and you can't help but laugh. Because some dev out there designed it that way. And I'm a big communications guy. I really just find it like one of the more fascinating and useful and important things that a human being can do. And I don't just mean, words themselves, but I really, I find body language super fascinating. I think the unspoken stuff is often the most telling and sometimes even the most loud in a lot of ways. And game design in general, especially shmups, is absolutely thick with this. There's so much body language that goes into it in terms of leading enemies and noticing how they're reacting to you. Are they inclined to follow? Are they on their own path? How can you manipulate them? And then the same with the shots themselves, and how they actually kind of come out. So yeah, in terms of mechanics, that's definitely one of my favorite, and being able to see that push-pull, that kind of dance in between the two.
Yeah.
So to kind of follow up with my own kind of question on that, I feel like here's the problem, is that it's hard for new players to even realize that that's a part of the game to engage with. How can we better communicate on board or get players into a point of realizing that there's sort of a dance that wants to be learned, that there's sort of steps to each stage, whether that be through routing, or just dealing with problematic enemies at first,
Yeah, that's another great question. I think it's tricky because as you and myself, from being in games long enough to know that okay, and others listening, I'm sure, to know that kind of dance exists, and when you get into that rhythm, you need to be in the experience for X amount of hours before you might even realize or stumble upon just what works for you with those kinds of things in mind. So when I think about someone jumping in for the first time, or they're fairly new, they've never really gone to any super great length with any given shmup, I think one of the simplest ways would probably be to have some kind of tutorial, just these small segments where I'm not sure how easy it would be to design these little snapshots, so to speak, of those experiences where to get the point across and for them to understand it's there, you would have to just articulate things and then say, okay, do this motion, because if you don't, you're going to see what happens. But just some way where there's a little demo section for these specific things. That might be very, very difficult to piece together in a meaningful way, but I think that would probably be one of the simplest ways to get people thinking about that kind of stuff.
So am I understanding your vision correctly? Would it be something the player is put in a section where the goal for them is to move up to the upper right hand corner of the screen and lead the shots as they do a big macro sweep? And you want the player to do that, so maybe you just have a looping section, and you demo it once to kind of show, maybe even have a little dotted line to be able to show that hey, this enemy is aiming at you, and then give the control to the player and like kind of
Yeah.
let them drill it a little bit.
And like if we're attempting to get the idea across that there are deeper things below the surface that like normally this player would not know unless they were in the game for longer, then I think like having notes on the screen, like, okay, because you're here, this is happening, or because like this is why you would want to go here, because you need to line up this and this, and then when you know these things are about to happen, that's when you want to like do this motion or whatever. Like, I'm not sure how it would all look, but I think there would need to be some way of taking that complex idea and just giving a very brief experience where someone can jump into it and experience it, and at least get a bit of a feeling for what's going on or what is under the surface.
Yeah. You know, that reminds me of one of my big like aha moments in playing these games was, I don't know, however many years ago, I came across this old PDF called Full Extent of the Jam. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah.
It's written by this guy, Prometheus. So that was like my Bible for understanding the mechanics of these games. It was the first time that I'd see anybody break down a full understanding of like what's happening with the scoring and like the enemies and stuff. But most importantly, he provided the blueprint for playing shmups in general in terms of like core tactics. You know, these are like the steps you need. And he talked about things like bullet streaming or bullet hurting, and tap dodging, and, you know, making use of space, or having a pattern that comes out splaying towards you and getting real close to it and slowly like backstepping in order to open up gaps, you know, and then to be able to do it. There was this manipulation that was happening with the bullet patterns that I had no idea was ever the case, because I would watch these like Japanese super plays on like VHS, and I was like, that's amazing, but that's also impossible. Like, I understand that a human being did it, but that human being is like clearly not made of like the same blood and bone that I am. Like, it just seemed so insane. But here this guy was, you know, bless his heart, or her heart, actually, I have no idea. But they provided the actual techniques that these top players were doing. And like, I have found very few shmups that actually make an effort to try to teach them.
Totally, yeah. It's like the rarest thing.
Yeah, there's a few of them. Bog Hog's game, Gunvein, that one had a really nice tutorial that actually directly addresses these techniques. There was another one, I'm so sorry I don't remember the name, to whoever made it. What's that?
Is it
Angel?
I think it's called Angel at Dusk or something like that.
So that one is actually a different one that I was thinking of.
Okay.
The one I was thinking of had these really plain like bitmap graphics that looked pretty I don't know, underwhelming, I would say. But the gameplay itself was super solid, and that's really what mattered. But they made a really good tutorial section that actually addressed some of this. And then I haven't played the Angel game, but I've watched videos of it. Yeah, and I saw some of the tutorial in that as well, which again, I thought did a great job of it.
Yeah.
I think part of the problem too, though, is it's sort of hard to get players to engage with tutorials. They're either seen once and totally forgotten. And in terms of like education, that's kind of the worst way to try to teach somebody. You really need to give them pieces of like the whole and create a foundation, and then each piece it's best to pause and directly apply it and work with it and have fun, throw it against the wall, bounce it a bit, and then go back and add another piece, do that in isolation, and then bring them together and build it up from there.
Yeah, interesting. I have an idea. I'll let you finish first if you want.
I guess my last little trailing thought about that is that perhaps instead of just tutorials, maybe a way forward is to build that into either a game mode where you're specifically, kind of building up the pieces of this like ziggurat pyramid that we work our way up. And it also makes me think of some of the best mechanics in terms of like scoring and stuff are often tied together with the techniques that you already use within the games. Like, for instance, grazing encourages you to stay close to the bullets. which at first might seem like, oh, just be kind of reckless, but hopefully not too reckless. But what it's really teaching you is just tap dodging. It's just saying like, hey, you don't have to move too far away, and we'll reward you for staying snug, in the bullet curtain. So yeah, maybe that's kind of a way forward.
Yeah, and it also, like grazing specifically, also teaches people to be a little more mindful of all the space they have. Like if, let's say, there are like two streams coming down, it's like, sure, you can flail all over the place in that free space, but at the same time, if something else is about to happen where it cuts that in half, it's like, well, you're going to want to just be a little more mindful of the space. Like you don't have to be, there's no reason to be using all that space, so why not just stay closer to the bullets? But yeah, like you touched on exactly what I was thinking about, building the tutorial mode into like a tutorial run mode where it's an actual full run. It's just that when the game sees you're, like, let's say tripping up on this, that's when the next little segment says, okay, well, here's the next piece to learn. So it kind of just like feeds these little bits and pieces without without people feeling like, okay, I'm just in this tutorial mode that takes 5 minutes. Like, no, this is an actual full run. You can go all the way through the game, but it will pop up with these important things that you can either learn or be reminded of, and that kind of stuff. So that's one idea that kind of came to mind too.
I dig it. I'm taking notes, like literally.
Yeah,
as we're talking here. Yeah, because I built a handful of shmup prototypes, and loved doing it. And it's still one of these things that, like, I'd love to put out a game at some point here. And these are the kind of questions that, like, I would love to address, Like, I don't know if it'll ever be something that I could put out as like a full, fledged 5-stage kind of entire game, but maybe just one stage, But I would love it if it had some of these pieces and parts kind of built into it. Yeah. Because there's, of course, other... I don't know if you necessarily call it a mechanic because it's more emergent, but there's these other elements of like shmup techniques, I suppose. You'll see why I'm sort of like gently stepping around it, because it's a little hard to describe. Let me paint a picture for you and see if you relate. So imagine playing like Rolling Gunner on Expert and some of the harder sections. Something that because it requires you to know a game and really be at that level. But a funny thing happens. Let me first start by saying, like, I do a lot of martial arts, like my entire life. That's been a huge obsession. And still, even now as a 40-something-year-old guy, I'm either studying it still by like watching fight footage and taking notes or exploring it. Digesting it one way or another, and I need to get back into like doing jiu-jitsu and stuff. It's so good for me. But point being, especially with wrestling, sparring and stuff, you develop what's called soft eyes. Like, you don't want to look somebody necessarily in the eyes. You want to kind of just focus on their like chest, their hips, and you let your focus kind of widen so that you can see all of the peripheral movement. So that way you can just react. So there's a funny thing that happens with shmups. Again, going back to imagine Rolling Gunner complex pattern, there's these times where I'm no longer looking at my ship. I'm no longer looking at the bullet pattern. My eyes are sort of unfocused. And it's usually in these moments where at the end of a boss fight, they might throw down this intense layered pattern, and you just kind of keep the motion together as, you're losing sight of even what you're focusing on. But the movements are so tight that you can't even afford to think that very thought out loud. And to me, it's hypnotic. It's this strange state where I almost kind of feel like my, eyes are going to start bleeding if I do it for too long. But it's sort of this special place where you feel almost elevated in a way, and it's this emergent thing that kind of comes out of it.
Yeah. That reminds me of one of the attacks in Space Moth DX, which I played a few years ago.
I never played it. It looked cool though.
Yeah. It's awesome. I love it. It's the same thing where like pretty much the whole screen is just full, and it's literally just like you tap once, you tap up, you tap over, and it's so full that like it's no longer about processing it. It's no longer about thinking it. You just trust the movements, and you have to do it. You can't think about it. Or at least that's what I remember thinking at the time. If I came back to it and with more experience like I have now, I might feel differently about it. But I definitely have had those situations where it's like there's just everything in your face, and you can't afford to be relying on something as primitive as thinking. Like it now has to be this other layer where it's just like something that has been built in, like that you've built into yourself, into your awareness, and you just let it take over and pull through it.
And again, like how interesting, it goes back to that paradox. Because again, in my life, paradox has always been a reliable North Star. If I find paradox within anything, I generally force myself to lean into it. There's usually always really interesting things that come out of that. And I would love for, anybody listening who's maybe just kind of casually into these games or maybe not at all. This is one of those paradoxes where if I show you this game, it is so simple. You're moving a block around and flinging pixels. Yet it can induce these like weird states of mind where you're, moving past your regular train of thought, and you're now existing in a place where it's in between, nerve impulses in your hands and what's being received by your eyes. But the intellectual element is like it's left in the dirt. You're now, sort of mainlining like some cerebral cortex or something. Yeah. Maybe not to get too hyperbolic, but it's really unique. You don't find that in many games. And even like fighting games, they can bring super detailed moments where your instinct just lets loose and you have a lot of muscle memory that comes into play, and it's awesome. But in my experience, shmups deliver something a little different. They kind of take you deep underwater, and it's that weird, murky letting go of the controls and just sort of trusting that your instincts are going to work that like brings you back out, and then before you know it, you're in the clouds. And I'm like, wow, absolutely wow. A simple game of flinging pixels can do this.
Yeah.
So cool.
I think it's part of the magic, because like your comparison with fighting games specifically, like fighting games are great. They're a very, very different breed. And as much as I'm very intrigued by them, there's just something so powerful about the experience that can unravel when you tap into shmups and when you just take it to such extreme depths. I always say in this video or that video, like, this is what I'm talking about. Not just that, like it's part of what I'm getting at. It's just, there's just something so rich and so deep and so exciting and so fascinating because it's so different from any other genre that I've ever experienced.
Yeah.
As awesome as other games are and the things they can offer, nothing will give you that unique shmup package. There's just, I've never come across even a hint of something similar. There's just something so unique about shmups.
Yeah, well said, Daze. Yeah. Well, listen, man, I feel like we could honestly talk for like another 3 hours. Of all of the questions and notes that I kind of took of stuff that I wanted to mention, I think we honestly only hit on like a quarter of it, if you can believe that. But I do have to hop on a work meeting in like 20 minutes here. So
yeah, no worries, man.
Yeah, we probably should wrap it up a little bit, but it would be super awesome to continue some of these conversations and stuff.
For sure. Well, I cannot thank you enough for setting aside some time to do this. I had a blast chatting, and we will definitely connect again. So yeah, really appreciate it. And huge thanks to everybody who stuck around and listened to this chat. I trust you enjoyed it as well. And that's all from me. So yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, me too, man. I had a really, really good time. This was super awesome. There's a neat, surreal kind of quality of following somebody's videos on YouTube and then before you know it, by just reaching out of your comfort zone, saying hello, and like kind of starting a conversation, boom, before you know it, you just talked for an hour and a half about some of your favorite stuff.
Yeah.
I can't think of a better way to spend my time. So yeah, thanks for making the videos. Thanks for being open to talking, and thanks for making time. This was super cool.
You're very welcome. All right, everybody, have a stellar one, and we will see you next time. Take care.